Hello, I'm Randy Mayu, Senior VP of Leadership Development with SGR. In my role, I am the go-to resource for executive book briefings, which serve to provide a great way for you and or your team to absorb the information provided in leading business books without having to read the full book yourself. In summary, I read the books so you don't have to. You can find more information about SGR's executive book briefings by going to governmentresource.com/book briefings. Now, I am proud to introduce the author of the award winning bestseller, Learn, Lead, Lift: How to Think, Act, and Inspire Your Way to Greatness. Wendy Ryan will present on mindful leadership. What story are you telling?
Good morning. How was the break? Good? Okay. Excellent. So I heard that we actually have some folks from Kansas and California here. Kansas or California? Raise your hand. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. And I have some new friends also from Bloomington, Illinois. So shout out to all of you for making the trip. Good job. So let's have a round of applause for people coming near and far. Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think my slides are going to come up in just a moment, but the reason that I want to put a shout out to Kansans and Californians is because I actually was born in Kansas. I was born in Wichita, and I still spend about a month every year there. So still very connected to the community. But I call San Jose, California my home the other 11 months of the year. So love to see some familiar people in this space, so to speak. So today we're talking about mindful leadership, right? And I love some of the things that I've heard already this morning. I think it's been such an inspiring conference, even just in the first couple of hours. But we're really going to talk just a little bit about not only my leadership story, but we're going to spend most of our time talking about your leadership story, because that's really what's most important. So this might look kind of like a kindergarten drawing, preschool. Maybe if some of you are generous, maybe it's a little bit more advanced than that. But this is basically my leadership story. And you might find some clues in there, a few other cities that I've lived in. And why do leadership stories matter? Well, a couple of reasons. One, because unless we understand our story, we're not going to understand what mindsets we have, and mindsets are a big part of what makes us the leaders that we are. Mindsets are how we think, right? So it's not what we think, it's how we think. They're like the mental lenses that we put on every day. We don't even know we put them on, but we wake up in the morning, they're already on our face, and they're the lenses through which we perceive everything. So whether it is information that we choose to attend to or ignore, or it's something as simple as, what's the kind of thing we like to read? What do we like to watch on TV? Our mindsets are actually always operating for us. So one of the things that digging into our leadership story does is it helps us excavate and uncover and notice what some of those mindsets that are operating for us are. And I think that's a good starting point for every leader. There's a couple of other things that matter in leadership. It's not all about mindsets, right? It's also about our skills, which are like our handheld tools. Think hammer, saw, nail. Those are things that we associate with expertise. It's the learning that we do along the way through experience. And every once in a while, those tools get a little rusty. They get a little out of date. So we really need to be mindful that our skills and our expertise that we might have acquired 90 years ago, 20 years ago now feels like 90 years ago. I don't know about any of you, but that's certainly true for me. 20 years ago, if we're still using the same tools, the same models, we might need to think about that. Are those getting a little rusty around the edges? The third thing that really matters in leadership is behaviors, right? So this is how we show up to other people. So how I use my tools and the impact my tools have on other people is really what we're talking about there. So mindsets, skill sets, and behaviors. That's really the three things that work together to create the leader that you are. And we're going to look at stories as a way to dig into what some of those mindsets are, and that's going to help you understand, why did I hone in on those particular skill sets? Why is it that I think I'm being humble, but nobody else is experiencing me that way? I see that resonates with a few of you. Anyone work for a boss who is like, yeah, I'm very humble, I'm a servant leader, I do all these things, and everybody else in the room is like, are you kidding me? There's no way. You are not the epitome of humility. Yeah, so I appreciate that. So 4 key questions, and this is going to be a time for you to do some reflection as well. So anybody have a pen? Hopefully all of you. Okay, yeah, you pick that up because you're going to use that. 4 key questions when we want to think about mindfulness and leadership. 1, why do I want to be a leader? So I'd like you to think about that and jot down any words, phrases, or images that come to mind. And if you're joining us online, then you can still do this from wherever you are. Just take a minute now to jot down, why do I want to be a leader right now? And I invite you to think about it not in terms of because I need to earn a salary or because I've done all this education and this is what I'm supposed to do. Why? Why else? It's a big question, right? A lot of us stumble into leadership. We don't necessarily start out saying, you know, my wish growing up was to be the director of public works. Or my wish growing up was to be leading HR for my city. None of us necessarily start out with that dream. Others of us are very intentional and we do work to get to a certain position within a certain field, and we're really passionate about that, very deliberate. But once you're there, however you got there, why do you want to be there? So next question, who am I being as a leader? So if you were to ask someone who works with you pretty closely, and you said, who am I being? How would you describe me to someone else? What would they say? And I want you to take a moment now to jot down any words, phrases, or images that come up around that question. Okay. I see lots of good thinking and wheels turning going on. So third question is, how does my leadership story impact other people? So if I were to sit down and tell someone in 2 minutes, what was my story of how I got to be a leader? What was my philosophy of leadership? Why did I run my meetings the way I do? However I wanted to tell that story. How does that impact other people? Do you know? Take a moment now and just jot down. Again, it can be a word, a phrase, or an image, or a couple of each. Good, and so last question here is, when could I share my story and invite other people to share their story? So what would it look like if I had a conversation with somebody about that and it was a two-way conversation? So when is there an opportunity coming up for you in the near future that you could do that? A team meeting? Tomorrow at the conference? The next all-hands meeting at work? Could be somewhere you volunteer. It could be sitting around the kitchen table eating with your family. So jot down, when are some times you could do that? Okay, now I know that as we did that, I noticed that the room got quieter, quieter, and quieter. So, and then the dread or the anxiety got higher and higher and higher. It's a big conversation to have with yourself, isn't it? So a couple of things before we go further. One is to understand that leadership is about influence. And especially when we connect it to servant leadership and we connect it to the future of leadership and the context we're in now, all of those things are signposts that tell us we need to really focus in on influence and impact. Those are really different than power and authority, right? As leaders, sometimes we have power, sometimes we have authority, and that can be helpful. But if that is how we are impacting people, we are not going to be the leaders we could be. We're not going to be what I would call a great leader. A great leader is someone who leads through influence. And it's a particular kind of influence, right? So it's not influence to get as much as I can for me, right? It's influence in service of moving something forward. It's not solely satisfying my own interests. So great leadership is about influencing in service of moving something forward or achieving something, but it's not solely in my own interests. When we choose to look at it that way, and we focus our intentions on being a great leader through influence, we unlock a lot more possibilities for ourselves. We start to see spaces that we can show up as leaders and we can have an impact much more broadly. So when Ron was talking this morning at the opening about maybe you can only influence one person, right? You can only be a leader to one person. This is what we're talking about. So some of us love data, and I wanted to offer you a little bit. So you say, hi, okay, I went through this painful process of asking these big questions about my leadership, and now I got to think about sharing it with someone else. Why is this worth it, Wendy? Well, our brains are primed to like to take in information in story format. I didn't design it, so I can't tell you good, bad, or otherwise, but we know that that's how our brains are designed. So this is about working as a leader with what is natural for people and what's easiest for people. So I actually did a study at Stanford University, and they studied people making presentations like the one I'm making now. And what they found is that only 5% of people could recall any data from the speech. 5%. There's always that 5% of people who, can do extraordinary things that I wish I could do. 63% of people could recall a story from the speech. That's a really big difference. So anytime you're looking as a leader to have impact, you want to think about what is the story I can tell to relay this information? Because it's going to be easier for people to take the information and do something with that and then remember it later. So that's one reason why storytelling is so powerful in leadership and why getting really clear on your own story is going to help you be more effective and more mindful. Your story can do 3 things really, really well. 1, it can develop or educate other people. So years ago, I worked at Nordstrom. Quick aside, I think everyone should have to, instead of the draft to go in the military, or maybe in addition to, everyone should have to work in a restaurant or retail for at least a year. Would you agree? Yes. I mean, there's too many things I could go on for hours about life lessons learned. But when I was working at Nordstrom, at the time it had this in it, it still does, but it had a really great reputation for customer service. Okay, you hear that as a trainee and you say, okay, that's great. What does that mean? And to this day, I remember the story my manager told me about how at one store, probably up in Seattle area, that one day a customer came in and tried to return a tire. Now, if anyone has been to Nordstrom, my Kansas City colleagues, does Nordstrom sell tires? No, Nordstrom doesn't sell tires. So what did that salesperson do? They took the tire back. They said, well, how much do you want for it? And the person said, I don't know, $75. Person took it back and gave him the money. Astonishing, astonishing. And the reason my manager told that story was because they knew that that was the quickest way to help us understand what the expectations were, right, for us as far as interacting with customers. I still remember that, and that was probably a couple decades ago. Let's leave it at that. You can build trust and relationships with your story. So if I tell you a story about my leadership, and especially if I include some of the lessons learned, I don't try to present myself as perfect, you're going to trust me more. Why? Because you're not perfect either. And we naturally don't trust people very much if they are like, I have no flaws, I've never done anything wrong, I've never failed. We know that's not true. And we relate to people who are more like us. So it's really important that you think about sharing your story, lessons learned, as a way to build relationship and trust. It's very powerful. Third thing that your story can do really well for you is it can influence stakeholders, right? So you all have constituents outside of your direct team that you're thinking about, that you're attending to, and that you have to deal with whatever comes your way in any given day and any given season. And your story can be influential in not just building relationships with stakeholders, but actually helping them think differently about the world. So it's important. So getting started, we already did a little bit of practice earlier. We're going to do a little bit more. I'd like you to pick one of these 4 questions that you see on the screen. And you can do this if you're joining us also from a remote location. But pick one of these stories, jot down your answer, think about your answer. And then I'm going to have you turn to the person to the right of you at your table. And I want you to share it with them. And then I want you to switch. So we'll start with the thinking time. Ready, set, go. Fun fact, the first one's probably the hardest. So, okay. Fast thinking time. It's time now to locate the person to the right of you at the table and share with them. And then switch. Okay, it's time to switch. So if you've shared your story, now I want you to listen to the other person's story. Okay, about 30 more seconds. And 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're back. So how was that? Thumbs up? I enjoyed it. Thumbs sideways? It was a little stressful. Thumbs down, never make me do that again. Thank you for being brave and doing that. This is not easy stuff. This is not easy. So you can actually go a little bit deeper than what we're doing here. And one of the tools for doing that is in your handout. So at the tables, and hopefully accessible to you online as well, is something called Your Learn, Lead, Lift Story. And this is a tool that my team developed based on the Learn, Lead, Lift framework, which is the leadership model that we use. And this is giving you some additional questions so you can use it to continue the reflection process. And then you can do something like what I showed you At the beginning of the presentation, you can create a visual leadership story. And this is not so that people can criticize you, it's so that you can get access to different insights. So if you're only using the left side of your brain all the time, right? You're only writing, you're only speaking, you're only thinking that way, you're not actually going to see or understand as much as if you activate your right brain too. So let me show you some examples of that. So one of the templates that we provide in your packet there is called the timeline. So if you're someone who really likes to think about stories in a sequential format, you know, you're the kind of person you're like, I hate going to those movies where they have flashbacks. You know, I like it when they start with once upon a time and it goes in a nice linear sequence. You might really enjoy the timeline. It's a good place for you to think about what key events shaped the way that I think, the skill sets I developed, and how I show up as a leader. Or you might enjoy the storyboard. So storyboard is something they use a lot in film and entertainment when they're trying to figure out how do we tell a story and incorporate visual elements. So you can do this digitally and you can add in media, GIFs, photos, videos, and then you can decide what's the narrative that would go along with that and then actually move things around. So it could be linear, or you could decide, no, I really like the flashbacks. I want to start with something really exciting, and then I want to talk about my story. I want to go back 10 years before that and connect the two. Last option that we have for you in the workbook is called the frame, and that's what I used earlier. And the frame is great for those of us who are a little more nonlinear in our thinking. And if you're a fan of brainstorming or mind mapping, you will love this. Notice it doesn't have to be drawing. You can just use words and arrows. So you don't have to be an artist to do any of these. One thing I want to point out is that this is the same person in each example. But if you look at each of them in turn, what you notice is that we see very different aspects of her leadership story come out. So that's why visualization is also really important. It changes the way we see and understand things. So I encourage you to experiment with all three and see what comes up for you and what you learn through that. So I'd like to leave you with a reminder that the most solid foundation for better leadership starts with applied mindfulness. Your most solid foundation starts with applying mindfulness. And that's what we've been doing here. So if you're interested in continuing the conversation, we do have a booth set up just outside of the hospitality desk. There's an exhibitor area. So I encourage you to just stop by, check out some of the resources we have there. And you're also welcome to reach out to me via LinkedIn or email, and definitely here for you to help you continue to think about how to be a more mindful leader. Thank you.